The first folks that I'm aware of coming to this part of North Carolina to make pottery were the Coles and the Craven family. The Coles moved here from Staffordshire, England in the 1750s and started making pots. They were cousins of mine. My family married into them. In fact, that's probably how they got into pottery. And pottery has been made continuously. It's an unbroken cycle since the time they got here. So that amounts to nearly 250 years. Of course, in those days, they were the community potters that provided the stuff to eat off of and store the food in, and utilitarian, useful vessels. All the old potters that I'm aware of, even up into my younger days, were farmers first. They had to farm and make something to eat, and then they did pottery. It's a cottage industry. I like to carry on the old tradition of making the old functional shapes, and you can still use them or you can decorate with them. This is quite a functional piece, just a plain old coffee mug. I could put anything in it, even drink beer out of it if you like. To do this, you have to like it, and I started when I was about 10 years old. My dad decided it was time for me to learn something to keep me out of trouble. So he built that wheel that's right behind you there in about 1956 and put it in the basement because that's the only place we had electricity. My grandpa's old shop had no electricity, and then we decided to move it up to the Coles, or he did, and we moved it up there for several years, and I turned and he would turn, and at J.B. Coles. My brother never really cared that much about it. Seems like he turned some, but not much. It's a 1-gallon whiskey jug. It's glazed inside and out. One of the major products of the potters around here during the years right after the Civil War, from say the 1870s through the early 1900s, were whiskey jugs. For transporting whiskey, a lot of stills were set up after the Civil War to turn the corn, because a lot of the livestock had been killed and they had good corn crops. They turned the corn into whiskey and sent it west for the final settlement of the West, where there was a big market for it. But then along comes like mason jars, the glass industry, and started replacing that in the early part of the 20th century. And that was their way of making a living, and it was hard to lose that. They had really nothing else. And again, that was sort of the really beginning of the decline, the really major decline in the need for handmade pottery. And the reason it almost died out in this area by the 1950s and 60s, there were only 2 or 3 operating potteries in this area. It was actually the beginning, the early part of this century, particularly I guess the 20s and 30s, and really by the 40s and 50s, industry had moved into Ohio, the pottery industry, mechanized industry. And they had begun to make lots of the vessels they needed in large quantities by machinery. And that helped us kind of start the decline of pottery, the need for the community potter, especially, well, I know it did around here in the Seagrove area. Instead of doing 10,000 pieces a year, they did 10,000 pieces a day. And so they sort of about put the old potters, the old community potters like my family had been since the 1860s in this area, about put them out of business.